Copyright CREDITS and copyright disclaimer. This narration script is a transformative adaptation based on the novel The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft. All rights to the original characters, plotline and source material belong to the original author and publishers. This script is created for narration, educational review, and entertainment purposes. In the heart of New England, where the rolling hills and verdant forests whisper secrets to the wind, lies the rural town of Dunwich, Massachusetts. A place shrouded in an aura of foreboding and decay, its history woven from the very fabric of darkness and despair. The town's existence is a mere whisper among the surrounding villages, a faint rumor of a place that time has forgotten and the world has chosen to neglect. As one approaches Dunwich, the landscape unfolds like a canvas of desolation, a bleak and barren expanse that seems to stretch on forever. The roads, once well-trodden and worn, now lie cracked and overgrown, as if the very earth itself has risen up to reclaim them. The trees, twisted and gnarled, stand like sentinels, their branches grasping towards the sky like skeletal fingers, as if in supplication to some ancient and malevolent deity. The town itself is a collection of crumbling houses, their windows like empty eyes staring back, their doors hanging crookedly on hinges that seem to scream in the wind. The streets, once bustling with life and laughter, now lie silent and still, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves and the distant, mournful howl of the wind. It is as if the very soul of the town has been extinguished, leaving behind only a hollow shell, a mere husk of what once was. The history of Dunwich is a dark and troubled one, filled with whispers of witchcraft and ancient rituals, of forbidden knowledge and unspeakable horrors. The town's founders, a group of settlers who arrived in the early 17th century, were said to have been driven by a desire to escape the constraints of civilization, to forge a new life in the wilderness, free from the prying eyes of the outside world. But as the years passed, the town became increasingly isolated, its inhabitants turning inward, their minds and souls consumed by the very darkness that surrounded them. The people of Dunwich are a curious lot, their faces gaunt and drawn, their eyes sunken and haunted. They move with a slow, deliberate pace, as if weighed down by the burden of their own secrets. Their voices are low and hushed, their words laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible hint of malevolence. It is as if they are hiding something, some terrible truth that they dare not speak aloud, lest the very walls themselves come crashing down around them. The air in Dunwich is heavy with an almost palpable sense of foreboding, a feeling that something is watching, waiting, and patiently biding its time. The sky above seems to press down upon the town, a physical weight that crushes the spirit and suffocates the soul. The wind, when it blows, carries with it a mournful sigh, a lament for all that has been lost and all that is yet to come. In the midst of this desolate landscape, there stands a house, a monstrosity of a building that seems to defy the very laws of nature itself. The house of the Whateley family, a place of dark legend, where the boundaries between reality and madness are blurred, and the horrors that lurk within are said to be beyond human comprehension. It is a place where the fabric of reality is thin, where the veil between the worlds is at its most fragile, and the horrors that lurk beyond are waiting, patiently, to pounce. The Whateleys themselves are a family shrouded in mystery, their history a tangled web of deceit and corruption. Their ancestors, a line of witches and warlocks, had practiced the dark arts, delving deep into the forbidden tomes of ancient knowledge and unleashing upon the world a horror beyond comprehension. The family's bloodline is said to be tainted, their genes carrying the curse of the Old Ones, a legacy of madness and terror that has been passed down through the generations. As the sun sets over Dunwich, the shadows cast by the trees grow long and sinister, like grasping fingers reaching out to snuff out the last vestiges of light. The wind begins to pick up, its mournful sigh growing louder, a death knell that tolls the approaching doom of all who dwell within the town's crumbling walls. And in the midst of this eerie, unsettling landscape, the house of the Whateleys stands, a monolith to the horrors that lurk within, a beacon of darkness that draws in the unwary, like moths to a flame. In this forsaken place, where the darkness reigns supreme, and the light of reason is but a distant memory, the horrors that lurk in the shadows wait patiently for their moment to strike. The people of Dunwich, trapped in their living nightmare, are powerless to stop the impending doom, their minds and souls consumed by the very evil that surrounds them. And as the darkness closes in, the town itself seems to whisper a haunting, otherworldly melody, a siren's call that beckons in the brave and the foolhardy to come and witness the horrors that lurk within its crumbling walls. In the dimly lit, rural town of Dunwich, where the mist-shrouded hills whispered secrets to the wind, and the trees seemed to twist in agony, a sense of foreboding settled over the residents like a shroud. It was the year 1913, and the Whateley family, with their dark and troubled history, was about to unleash a terror beyond comprehension. The birth of Wilbur Whateley, the son of Lavinia Whateley, a deformed and unstable woman, was imminent, and the town was abuzz with an unspoken sense of dread. Lavinia, a recluse, lived with her father, Noah Whateley, in a crumbling, ancient house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a tangle of overgrown gardens and twisted, nightmarish trees. The once grand house, with its weathered facade and crooked chimney, seemed to lean in, as if listening to the whispers of the wind, its windows like empty eyes staring back. The Whateleys were an old family, with roots that delved deep into the dark, mystical soil of Dunwich, and their history was one of decay, madness, and unutterable horror. As the winter of 1912 drew to a close, the people of Dunwich began to notice a change in the behavior of the local whippoorwills, those nocturnal birds with their haunting, mournful cries. They would gather in eerie, unnatural numbers around the Whateley house, their eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark, as if drawn by some unseen force. The townsfolk would hear their piercing calls, a chilling serenade that seemed to come from all directions, and feel a creeping sense of unease. It was as if the whippoorwills were waiting, watching, and warning of some impending doom. On the night of February 2, 1913, a fierce, unnatural storm swept through Dunwich, bringing with it a torrent of rain, hail, and an unearthly, pulsating lightning that seemed to sear the sky. The winds howled like a chorus of the damned, and the trees creaked and groaned, their branches like skeletal fingers grasping for the heavens. Within the Whateley house, Lavinia, her body twisted in agony, gave birth to a son, Wilbur, a child whose arrival would signal the beginning of a descent into unutterable horror. The birth was a difficult one, and the townsfolk who had gathered outside the house, waiting and watching, reported hearing strange, unearthly screams like the wailing of the damned emanating from within. They saw the windows of the house glow with an otherworldly, flickering light, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn asunder. And when the storm finally passed, the people of Dunwich emerged from their homes, blinking in the bright, cold light of dawn, to find that the whippoorwills had vanished, their haunting cries silenced, as if they had fulfilled their dark purpose. In the aftermath of Wilbur's birth, the Whateley house seemed to loom larger, its presence more oppressive, as if it had become a nexus of dark, eldritch power. The townsfolk whispered of the child's father, a mysterious, otherworldly being said to be Yog-Sothoth, a monstrous, tentacled creature from beyond the stars, a creature of unutterable, malevolent power. They spoke of Lavinia's dark, twisted past, of her dealings with forbidden, ancient tomes, and her attempts to summon forth a horror beyond human comprehension. As the days passed, the people of Dunwich began to notice a change in the child, Wilbur, a change that was both fascinating and terrifying. He grew at an unnatural rate, his body twisting, contorting, and elongating, like a thing from a nightmare. His eyes seemed to burn with an inner, malevolent fire, and his presence was accompanied by an aura of unspeakable, creeping horror. The townsfolk would catch glimpses of him, playing in the overgrown gardens, his laughter like the tinkling of 1,000 tiny bells, and feel a sense of dread, a sense of foreboding that seemed to seep into their very souls. In the dead of night, when the moon hung low in the sky, and the shadows seemed to come alive, the people of Dunwich would hear the sound of strange, unnatural rituals emanating from the Whateley house. They would hear the chanting, the wailing, and the screams, like the cries of the damned, and know that Lavinia, Wilbur, and Noah were engaged in dark, forbidden practices, practices that would unleash a horror beyond human comprehension. The wind would carry the scent of decay, corruption, and death, and the townsfolk would know that they were living in the shadow of a terror that would soon consume them all. The birth of Wilbur Whateley marked the beginning of a descent into madness, a journey into the very heart of horror, and the people of Dunwich, caught in the grip of an unseen, malevolent force, were powerless to stop it. The darkness that had been unleashed would spread like a stain across the town, consuming everything in its path, and the Whateley family, with their twisted, nightmarish history, would be at the center of it all, their names becoming synonymous with terror, horror, and the unutterable, eldritch power of the unknown. In the dimly lit, rural town of Dunwich, a sense of unease settled over the residents like a shroud, as if the very presence of Wilbur Whateley was a harbinger of doom. His growth, both physically and intellectually, was a phenomenon that defied explanation, a twisted mockery of nature's laws. As the years passed, Wilbur's frame expanded with an unnatural rapidity, his limbs lengthening, his torso thickening until he became a towering figure, a behemoth of a boy with an unwholesome, unnatural strength. His face, too, underwent a transformation, the features sharpening, the eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intelligence, as if the very essence of the cosmos had been distilled within his gaze. The townsfolk would whisper among themselves, awed and terrified by the boy's precocious development, his intellect blossoming like a dark, malignant flower. Wilbur's mind was a sponge, absorbing knowledge with an insatiable hunger, devouring texts on mathematics, astronomy, and the forbidden arts with an ease that belied his tender years. As he delved deeper into the mysteries of the occult, Wilbur's fascination with the dark, arcane sciences grew, until he became obsessed with the study of forbidden knowledge. He would spend hours poring over dusty, leather-bound tomes, seeking out obscure, forgotten rituals and practicing spells in hushed, whispered tones. The local scholars, men of learning and reason, were both drawn to and repelled by Wilbur's intellect, sensing the darkness that lurked beneath his words, the malevolent intent that seethed beneath his surface. Dr. Henry Armitage, the librarian at Miskatonic University, would often receive visits from Wilbur, who would arrive unannounced, his eyes aglow with an unnatural intensity as he sought out rare, esoteric texts. Armitage, a man of discerning taste and learning, was both fascinated and disturbed by Wilbur's thirst for knowledge, his unwholesome, almost vampiric hunger for the secrets of the cosmos. He would watch, a mixture of awe and trepidation, as Wilbur devoured page after page of forbidden lore, his mind absorbing the dark, eldritch secrets with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. As the months passed, Wilbur's interactions with the local scholars became increasingly strained, his words laced with a subtle, venomous intent, as if he sought to draw them into his dark, twisted world. He would speak of ancient, forgotten deities, of elder gods who slumbered, waiting for the stars to align and the gates of reality to be flung open. His voice would drop to a whisper, his eyes glinting with an otherworldly light as he spoke of the Necronomicon, the cursed, blasphemous text that held the secrets of the old ones. The scholars, men of reason and science, would listen, entranced, as Wilbur wove a web of dark, hypnotic words, drawing them into a realm of madness and terror. They would leave his presence, shaken, their minds reeling with the implications of his words, the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality. And yet they would return, drawn by some morbid fascination, some twisted desire to gaze into the abyss, to confront the darkness that lurked within Wilbur's eyes. As the seasons passed, Wilbur's malevolence grew, his presence a dark, palpable thing, a cancer that spread its roots, infecting all it touched. The townsfolk would whisper of strange, unexplained occurrences, of livestock found mutilated, of crops withering and dying, as if some dark, malignant force had been unleashed upon the land. And at the center of it all, Wilbur stood, a monolith of darkness, his eyes aglow with an otherworldly power, his mind afire with an insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge. The wind would howl through the streets of Dunwich, a mournful, keening sound, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel, as if the gates of madness were slowly, inexorably being flung open. And in the midst of it all, Wilbur Whateley stood, a towering figure, a monstrous, eldritch thing, his presence a harbinger of doom, a reminder that some secrets were meant to remain forever hidden, some knowledge too terrible to be unleashed upon the world. The darkness that lurked within him, a darkness that grew with each passing day, would eventually consume them all, plunging the town of Dunwich into an abyss of horror, a living nightmare from which there would be no escape. In the dimly lit recesses of his crumbling family mansion, Wilbur Whateley devoted himself to the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, delving ever deeper into the mysteries of the occult. The musty scent of aged tomes and the flickering dance of candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls as he pored over ancient texts, seeking the hidden secrets of the cosmos. His eyes, aglow with an unnatural intensity, scanned the yellowed pages of the Necronomicon, that most blasphemous of books, as he struggled to decipher the arcane script that held the keys to ultimate power. The words of the mad Arab, Alhazred, seemed to sear themselves into his brain, filling his mind with visions of eldritch horrors and otherworldly realms. Wilbur's fascination with the dark arts had begun innocently enough, a mere curiosity sparked by the whispered tales of his mother, but it had since grown into an all-consuming obsession, driving him to seek out ever more esoteric and forbidden knowledge. His translations of the Necronomicon, laboriously scrawled into a series of leather-bound notebooks, began to take on a life of their own, as if the very words themselves were imbuing him with a dark and malevolent energy. As the seasons passed, the people of Dunwich began to notice a change in Wilbur, a change that was both subtle and profound. His eyes, once a bright and curious blue, had taken on a milky, almost opalescent sheen, as if the very fabric of his soul was being slowly consumed by the eldritch powers he sought to wield. His smile, once wide and friendly, had grown twisted and sinister, like the grin of a predator savoring its prey. And his voice, low and husky, seemed to carry on its breath the whispers of 1,000 midnights, sending shivers down the spines of those who dared to listen. The strange creatures that began to appear in the area, twisted and deformed abominations that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, were seen as a manifestation of Wilbur's dark experiments, a physical embodiment of the horrors that lurked within the recesses of his mind. They would be seen lurking in the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, as if they were the product of some twisted union between the human and the non-human. The people of Dunwich whispered among themselves of the unholy rituals that took place beneath the light of the full moon, of the blasphemous invocations that echoed through the deserted streets, and of the unutterable horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. The air itself seemed to thicken and grow heavy with an almost palpable sense of malevolence, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. The once peaceful town of Dunwich was now a place of dark and foreboding terror, where the laws of nature were twisted and distorted, and the very notion of sanity was stretched to its breaking point. The creatures that Wilbur had summoned, or perhaps even created, seemed to be growing in power and numbers, their twisted forms becoming more and more brazen as they began to venture forth from the shadows, their eyes fixed upon the trembling populace like cold, calculating predators. The wind that rustled through the leaves of the trees seemed to carry on its breath the whispers of the damned, a chilling susurrus that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened residents. The moon, once a silver crescent in the night sky, now hung low and bloated, like a corpse-filled balloon, casting an eerie, sickly glow over the landscape. And in the midst of this growing chaos, Wilbur Whateley stood at the center, his eyes aglow with an otherworldly energy, his mind afire with the promise of ultimate knowledge and the secrets of the cosmos. His dealings with otherworldly beings, creatures from beyond the stars, had become more frequent and more brazen, as if he was now a key player in some grand, cosmic drama. The whispers of the old ones, ancient and forgotten deities from beyond the veil of reality, seemed to echo through his mind, guiding him, tempting him, and corrupting him with promises of power and knowledge beyond his wildest dreams. And yet, despite the horrors that he had unleashed, Despite the terrors that now stalked the streets of Dunwich, Wilbur remained resolute, driven by a hunger for knowledge that would not be satiated until he had unlocked the very secrets of the universe. The consequences of his actions, however, were only just beginning to manifest, like the first, tentative tremors of an earthquake that would soon shake the very foundations of reality. The fabric of the world was beginning to fray, thread by thread, as the eldritch powers that Wilbur had unleashed began to assert their dominance over the mortal realm. The people of Dunwich, once a hardy and stoic folk, were now gripped by a creeping sense of dread, a feeling that they were living on borrowed time, and that the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of reality were waiting patiently for their moment to strike. And in the midst of this growing chaos, Wilbur Whateley stood, his eyes aglow with an unnatural energy, his mind afire with the promise of ultimate knowledge, and his soul forever lost to the abyss of madness and despair. In the dimly lit, cyclopean chambers of the Whateley farmhouse, a sense of foreboding settled over the rustic landscape like a shroud. The trees, once green and vibrant, now stood as skeletal sentinels, their branches etched against the moon like bony fingers. It was as if nature itself was recoiling in horror from the eldritch rituals that Wilbur Whateley had been conducting in the dead of night. The wind, heavy with the scent of decay and corruption, whispered an otherworldly melody through the empty halls, a haunting serenade that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house. As the winter solstice approached, Wilbur's behavior became increasingly erratic, his eyes gleaming with an unholy intensity in the dark. His twisted, misshapen form seemed to be undergoing a grotesque metamorphosis, as if his very body was being reshaped by the dark forces he sought to summon. The villagers, already wary of the Whateley clan, avoided the farmhouse altogether, whispering tales of witchcraft and demonic possession in hushed, frightened tones. They spoke of Wilbur's unnatural strength, of the way he could lift massive stones with ease, and of the strange, pungent odor that clung to him like a miasma. And yet, Wilbur's ultimate goal remained shrouded in mystery, a terrible and awe-inspiring secret that only he knew. His was a mind consumed by an insatiable hunger for forbidden knowledge, a hunger that drove him to delve ever deeper into the arcane tomes and ancient grimoires that lined the dusty shelves of his father's library. The words of the mad Arab, Alhazred, seemed to hold a particular fascination for him, and he would often spend hours poring over the yellowed pages of the Necronomicon, his eyes burning with an unnatural fervor as he unraveled the secrets of the cosmos. It was on one fateful, snow-shrouded night that Wilbur's dark ambitions finally reached their climax. The moon hung low in the sky, a silver sickle that cast an eerie glow over the frozen landscape. The wind, now a mournful sigh, seemed to carry the whispers of the damned on its breath, and the trees creaked and groaned like tortured souls as Wilbur, his voice raised in a frenzied incantation, attempted to summon the dreaded Yog-Sothoth from beyond the veil of reality. The words of the incantation, a twisted litany of ancient power, seemed to take on a life of their own, echoing through the chambers like a maddening refrain that shook the very foundations of the house. As the ritual reached its frenzied climax, a blinding flash of light illuminated the darkened room, and a sound like thunder boomed through the night air, shaking the rafters and sending the trees swaying in terror. The walls seemed to shudder and tremble, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn asunder by the eldritch power that Wilbur had unleashed. And in the heart of the maelstrom, Wilbur Whateley stood tall, his twisted form aglow with an otherworldly energy as he beheld the horror that he had summoned. But it was not to be. The creature, a twisted, amorphous mass of writhing, pulsing tendrils, was not of this world, and its presence was too great for Wilbur's mortal form to contain. The young man's body began to contort and twist, his limbs elongating like rubber as his skin turned a deep, bloody red. His face, once twisted in a grimace of ecstasy, now contorted in a scream of agony as his very essence was torn asunder by the eldritch power that he had unleashed. And then in an instant it was over. The light vanished, the thunder ceased, and an oppressive silence fell over the farmhouse like a shroud. Wilbur Whateley, the monstrous, misshapen creature, lay dead on the floor, his body a twisted, inhuman mass of flesh and blood. The air was heavy with the stench of decay and corruption, and the trees, once again, stood silent and still, their branches frozen in a gesture of perpetual horror. As the news of Wilbur's death spread, the villagers, emboldened by the young man's passing, began to whisper of the horrors that he had unleashed upon the world. They spoke of the twisted, cyclopean creatures that now roamed the countryside, their twisted forms a testament to the eldritch power that Wilbur had summoned. They spoke of the strange, glowing symbols that now adorned the walls of the farmhouse, symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and of the unutterable, soul-shattering horror that lurked just beyond the veil of reality, waiting to consume all in its path. In the aftermath of Wilbur's death, the farmhouse, once a symbol of rustic simplicity, stood as a monolith to the horrors that lurked beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The trees, once green and vibrant, now stood as skeletal sentinels, guarding the secrets of the damned, and the wind, heavy with the scent of decay and corruption, whispered an otherworldly melody through the empty halls, a haunting serenade that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house. The darkness that had driven Wilbur to summon the dreaded Yog-Sothoth still lingered, a palpable presence that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves, waiting to consume all who dared to enter. As the seasons passed, the legend of Wilbur Whateley grew, a cautionary tale of the horrors that awaited those who delved too deep into the mysteries of the cosmos. The villagers, once wary of the Whateley clan, now avoided the farmhouse altogether, whispering tales of witchcraft and demonic possession in hushed, frightened tones. And in the dead of night, when the moon hung low in the sky, they would swear they could hear the whispers of the damned, a chilling reminder of the horrors that Wilbur Whateley had unleashed upon the world. The darkness that had driven him to summon the eldritch power still lingered, a malevolent presence that seemed to seep from the very earth itself, waiting to consume all who dared to enter the accursed place. The memory of Wilbur Whateley would live on, a testament to the horrors that lurked beyond the boundaries of human understanding. His twisted, misshapen form would haunt the dreams of those who knew him, a grim reminder of the eldritch power that he had unleashed upon the world. And in the darkness, the whispers of the damned would continue to echo, a haunting serenade that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the house, a reminder of the horrors that awaited those who dared to delve too deep into the mysteries of the cosmos. The darkness would linger, a palpable presence that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves, waiting to consume all who dared to enter the accursed place. In the aftermath of Wilbur Whateley's gruesome demise, a sense of unease settled over the town of Dunwich, like a shroud cast over a corpse. The scholars who had been investigating the strange occurrences in the town, led by Dr. Armitage, were left to ponder the implications of the horror they had uncovered. The death of Wilbur, with its attendant mutilations and bizarre circumstances, had left them all with a deepening sense of dread, a feeling that the horrors they had witnessed were far from over. As they delved deeper into the mystery, they began to realize that Wilbur's death was merely a symptom of a far greater malaise, a cancer that had infected the very fabric of the town. The strange symbols etched into the walls, the eerie whispers that seemed to emanate from the shadows, and the unexplained disappearances of livestock and even people, all pointed to a dark and malevolent force that had taken hold of Dunwich. The investigation into Wilbur's death was a painstaking and often frustrating process, as if the very forces of nature were conspiring against them to keep the truth hidden. The authorities, led by the skeptical and pragmatic Sheriff Sawyer, were initially resistant to the idea that anything supernatural was at play, preferring instead to focus on the more mundane aspects of the case. But as the evidence mounted and the strange occurrences continued to pile up, even the most hardened skeptics were forced to confront the reality of the horror that had been unleashed. Dr. Armitage, with his vast knowledge of the occult and his experience with the darker corners of human nature, was the first to realize the true extent of the horror that had been unleashed. He knew that Wilbur's death was not just a simple murder, but a symptom of a far greater evil, one that threatened to consume the entire town. As he pored over the ancient tomes and forbidden knowledge that Wilbur had left behind, he began to grasp the true nature of the horror that had been unleashed, a horror that defied human comprehension and pushed the boundaries of sanity. The more he learned, the more he realized that the horror was not just a product of Wilbur's twisted mind, but a doorway to a realm of unspeakable terror, a realm that had been hidden from humanity for centuries. The symbols etched into the walls, the whispers in the darkness, and the unexplained disappearances were all mere portents of a far greater horror, one that threatened to consume the entire town and everyone in it. As the days passed, the sense of dread that had settled over Dunwich grew, like a palpable presence that hung in the air. People began to whisper among themselves, sharing stories of strange occurrences and unexplained events, and the town was gripped by a growing sense of fear and uncertainty. The scholars, led by Dr. Armitage, worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, but the more they learned, the more they realized that the horror was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The death of Wilbur had merely opened the doorway to a realm of unspeakable terror, a realm that had been hidden from humanity for centuries. The symbols etched into the walls, the whispers in the darkness, and the unexplained disappearances were all mere portents of a far greater horror, one that threatened to consume the entire town and everyone in it. As the darkness gathered, the people of Dunwich huddled together in fear, unsure of what the future held or what horrors lay in store for them. The scholars, led by Dr. Armitage, were the only ones who knew the true extent of the horror that had been unleashed, and they were powerless to stop it. All they could do was watch in horror as the town of Dunwich was consumed by the very evil that had been unleashed, a evil that would stop at nothing to claim the souls of all who lived there. The wind howled through the streets like a chorus of the damned as the darkness deepened and the shadows grew long and sinister. The people of Dunwich knew that they were in the grip of a malevolent force, one that would not rest until it had claimed them all. And in the midst of this chaos, Dr. Armitage and his team of scholars were the only ones who knew the truth, a truth that was too terrible to comprehend, a truth that would haunt them for the rest of their days. As the night wore on, the shadows grew longer and darker, like grasping fingers, reaching out to snuff out the last vestiges of hope. The people of Dunwich were trapped in a living nightmare, with no escape from the horror that had been unleashed. And in the midst of this chaos, the scholars, led by Dr. Armitage, were the only ones who knew that the horror was far from over, that it was only just beginning, and that the true terror was yet to come. The darkness closed in like a shroud, suffocating the town of Dunwich, and the people were left to face the horror that had been unleashed, alone and unprepared. The scholars, led by Dr. Armitage, were the only ones who knew the truth, a truth that was too terrible to comprehend, a truth that would haunt them for the rest of their days. And as the night wore on, they could only watch in horror as the town of Dunwich was consumed by the very evil that had been unleashed, a evil that would stop at nothing to claim the souls of all who lived there. In the dimly lit, forsaken town of Dunwich, a sense of unutterable horror had begun to settle, like a shroud cast over the crumbling houses and the crumbling lives of its inhabitants. It was as if the very fabric of reality had grown thin, allowing glimpses of an abyssal realm to seep into the world of men. The rituals of Wilbur Whateley, that twisted and doomed soul, had unleashed a terror beyond comprehension, a terror that now stalked the streets and the shadows, leaving death and madness in its wake. The creatures that emerged from the void were unlike anything that had ever been seen before. Twisted, monstrous beings born of dark and forbidden knowledge, they moved with an unnatural gait, their bodies a mass of writhing, pulsing tendrils, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly green fire. They were the offspring of Wilbur's dark rituals, the product of his maddening quest for power and his unholy union with the unknown. And they were hungry, ravenous for the flesh and the souls of men. As they moved through the town, the air grew thick with an eerie, unnatural silence. The trees seemed to lean away, as if in terror, their branches like withered fingers reaching for the sky. The wind died, and an unearthly stillness fell, as if the very breath of the world had been extinguished. And then the screams began. The screams of the damned, the screams of the terrified, the screams of those who had seen the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality. The creatures moved with a purpose, their twisted forms gliding across the ground with an unnatural ease. They seemed to be drawn to the homes of the townspeople, as if they could sense the warmth, the life, the very essence of humanity that dwelled within. And when they found it, they struck, their twisted bodies unfolding like dark, living flowers, their tendrils wrapping around the doors, the windows, the very foundations of the houses. The sound of shattering glass, of splintering wood, of screams and wails, echoed through the streets, a cacophony of terror that seemed to have no end. The people of Dunwich, those who had not yet fallen prey to the creatures, cowered in their homes, praying for dawn, praying for rescue, praying for an end to the horror that had been unleashed upon them. But there was no escape, no respite, for the creatures were everywhere, their twisted forms multiplying, spreading, infecting the very air itself with their madness. The world had gone mad, and the laws of nature, the laws of reality, seemed to have been torn asunder. And at the heart of the horror, at the center of the maelstrom, stood the Whateley farm, that cursed and accursed place, where Wilbur's dark rituals had been performed, where the gates of the abyss had been opened, and the horrors from beyond had been unleashed. The house itself seemed to have changed, its walls twisted, its windows glowing with an otherworldly light, as if it had become a portal, a gateway to the void. The wind howled through its empty halls, a mournful, despairing cry, as if the very house itself was screaming in agony. The creatures, the twisted, monstrous beings seemed to be drawn to the house, as if they were being called, summoned by some dark and ancient power. They moved towards it, their forms blurring, merging, becoming one with the darkness that surrounded them. And as they reached the house, they seemed to disappear, to be absorbed into the very fabric of the building, as if they were returning to the womb, to the source of their creation. The world was ending, the fabric of reality was unraveling, and the people of Dunwich were being consumed, one, by the horrors that lurked beyond the veil. The darkness was spreading, a living, breathing thing that seemed to have a life of its own. And in the midst of it all, the Whateley farm stood, a monolith, a testament to the horrors that had been unleashed, a reminder of the terror that lurked beyond the edges of the world. The moon was hidden, the stars were obscured, and the night was a living, breathing thing, a thing that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The creatures, the twisted, monstrous beings were everywhere, their forms blurring, merging, becoming one with the darkness. And in the midst of it all, the people of Dunwich were being consumed, their screams echoing through the night, their bodies torn, their souls shattered. The world had gone mad, and the horrors from beyond had been unleashed, bringing with them a terror that would never end. In this desolate, forsaken landscape, where the laws of nature had been torn asunder and the fabric of reality had been unraveled, there was only one certainty. The horror would never end, the terror would never cease, and the darkness would never be vanquished. For in the depths of the abyss, there were always more horrors waiting, more terrors lurking, more darkness to be unleashed. And the people of Dunwich, those who had survived the initial onslaught, would be forever changed, forever haunted by the memories of the horrors that had been unleashed upon them. They would be forever trapped in a living nightmare, a nightmare from which there was no escape, no respite, and no awakening. In the dimly lit, cyclopean streets of Dunwich, a sense of unutterable dread settled over the remaining inhabitants like a shroud, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The once quaint village, now a mere shadow of its former self, lay in ruins, its people either fled in terror or consumed by the eldritch horror that had been unleashed upon the world. The air was heavy with an otherworldly presence, a malevolent force that seemed to seep from the very pores of the earth itself, poisoning all it touched. As the last remnants of sunlight faded, casting the village in an eerie, flickering twilight, a small band of survivors huddled together in desperate conference. Their faces, gaunt and drawn, reflected the depths of their despair, for they knew that they stood as the only barrier between the monstrous, tentacled creature and the unsuspecting world beyond Dunwich. The creature, a spawn of the Old Ones, born of human and non-human stock, had grown in power and malevolence with each passing moment, its influence spreading like a stain across the landscape. Dr. Armitage, his eyes sunken, his voice laced with a quiet determination, spoke of the ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge that might, just might, hold the key to stopping the creature's relentless advance. His words, laced with a sense of urgency, painted a picture of a world on the brink of collapse, where the laws of nature no longer applied, and the very fabric of reality was torn asunder. The others listened, entranced, as he spoke of the whispered incantations, the arcane symbols, and the eldritch formulas that might, if performed correctly, banish the creature back to the depths of madness from which it had emerged. But as they spoke, the shadows deepened, and the wind began to pick up, carrying on its sighing breath the faint, piping whispers of the creature, a chilling, unearthly melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The ground trembled beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was alive, and in torment, and the sky grew darker, as if night was falling not just over Dunwich, but over the entire world. The stars twinkled like cold, dead eyes in the darkening sky, and the moon, now a silver crescent, cast an eerie glow over the landscape. The ritual, if it was to be performed, would have to be done quickly, for the creature was growing in power by the minute, its influence spreading, a palpable, suffocating presence that threatened to consume them all. The survivors, their hearts heavy with foreboding, knew that they were taking a terrible risk, for if the ritual failed, they would be doomed, and the world would be plunged into an abyss of madness and terror. But they also knew that they had no choice, for to do nothing would be to invite certain destruction, and the thought of the creature, unopposed, rampaging across the world, was too terrible to contemplate. As they made their way through the deserted streets to the site of the ritual, the whispers grew louder, the piping melody more intense, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe like living things. The air was thick with an eerie, pulsating energy, and the ground trembled, as if the earth was being torn apart from the inside out. The stars seemed to pulse in time with the creature's whispers, and the moon cast an eerie, silver glow over the landscape, as if it was being drawn into the ritual against its will. The ritual itself, a complex, arcane dance of words and symbols and gestures, was performed with a desperate, frenzied intensity, as if the very fate of the world depended on its success. The words, ancient and forbidden, seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, a defiance of the creature and the old ones who had spawned it. The symbols, drawn in blood and dust and ashes, seemed to pulse, with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive and feeding off the terror of the participants. The gestures, intricate and complex, seemed to weave a spell of protection and banishment around the participants, as if they were trying to keep the creature and its influence at bay. But as the ritual reached its climax, the creature, sensing its chance, made its move, bursting forth from the shadows in a riot of tentacles and writhing, pulsing flesh. The survivors, frozen in terror, could only watch as the creature, its malevolent presence overwhelming, began to disrupt the ritual, its influence spreading like a stain across the landscape. The words, the symbols, the gestures all seemed to fail, as the creature's power grew and grew, until it was a living, breathing thing, a monster of unutterable horror. The consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate, as the creature, unopposed, began to rampage across the world, leaving destruction and madness in its wake. The survivors, few and scattered, were left to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of the horror that had been unleashed upon the world. The ritual, a desperate last-ditch attempt to stop the creature, had failed, and now all that was left was to try and survive in a world gone mad. The darkness that followed was absolute, a living, breathing thing that seemed to have a presence of its own. The stars were gone, the moon was hidden, and the world was plunged into an abyss of madness and terror. The creature was everywhere, its influence spreading like a stain across the landscape, until it was impossible to tell what was real and what was not. The survivors, few and scattered, were left to navigate this twisted, nightmarish world where the laws of nature no longer applied and the very fabric of reality was torn asunder. In this desolate, post-apocalyptic landscape, the survivors were forced to confront the ultimate horror that had been unleashed upon the world. The creature, a monstrous, tentacled thing, was the embodiment of all their deepest fears, a living, breathing thing that seemed to have a presence of its own. The ritual, a desperate last-ditch attempt to stop the creature, had failed, and now all that was left was to try and survive in a world gone mad. The final confrontation was a desperate last-ditch attempt to stop the creature and restore some semblance of order to the world. The survivors, few and scattered, were forced to use all their knowledge and skills to try and defeat the creature and banish it back to the depths of madness from which it had emerged. The battle was fierce and intense, with the creature using all its power and influence to try and destroy the survivors and the world they represented. In the end, it was a desperate last-ditch attempt that saved the world from the creature's malevolent influence. The survivors, using all their knowledge and skills, were able to defeat the creature and banish it back to the depths of madness from which it had emerged. The world was saved, but the cost was high, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces and try to make sense of the horror that had been unleashed upon the world. The ritual, a desperate last-ditch attempt to stop the creature, had succeeded, but the consequences of the creature's influence would be felt for generations to come. In the somber aftermath of that fateful day, the town of Dunwich lay shrouded in an unholy mist, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder, allowing an eldritch presence to seep into the world of men. The people, once simple and unassuming, now moved with a sense of dread, their faces gaunt and their eyes sunken, as if they had glimpsed the abyssal horrors that lurked beyond the veil of sanity. The trees, once green and vibrant, now stood as skeletal sentinels, their branches etched against the sky like bony fingers, as if warning of the unspeakable terror that had been unleashed upon the world. The memory of Wilbur Whateley, that grotesque and aberrant creature, still lingered, a monstrous specter that haunted the dreams of those who had crossed his path. His twisted, cyclopean form, a blasphemy against the natural order, had been a mere precursor to the eldritch abomination that had followed, a creature of unutterable horror, born of dark and forbidden rituals, and nurtured on the very essence of madness. The recollection of its twisted, pulsing mass, its bulging, greenish-gray flesh, and its malevolent, glowing eyes still seared the minds of those who had beheld it, leaving an indelible mark of terror that would haunt them for the rest of their days. As the days passed, the town of Dunwich struggled to come to terms with the enormity of what had transpired. The survivors, few and far between, whispered of the horrors they had witnessed, their voices barely audible, as if they feared that the mere utterance of the words would summon forth the very terrors they sought to describe. They spoke of the strange, pungent odors that still lingered, a noxious miasma that clung to the streets and the buildings, a constant reminder of the unholy presence that had defiled their town. They spoke of the unexplained noises, the creaks and the groans that echoed through the night, as if the very foundations of the earth were shifting and trembling, as if the old ones themselves were stirring, awakened by the rituals and the sacrifices that had been made in their name. The scholars, who had once delved into the forbidden tomes, now realized the terrible mistake they had made. They had unleashed a horror beyond their wildest imagination, a horror that had brought about the downfall of their town and the destruction of their very souls. They knew that they had meddled with forces beyond their control, forces that had been better left alone, and that they had paid the ultimate price for their hubris and their arrogance. The books, once revered and coveted, now lay scattered and torn, their pages burned and destroyed, as if the very words themselves were tainted with an otherworldly evil. As the seasons changed and the years went by, the town of Dunwich slowly began to heal, but the scars of that terrible day would never fully fade. The people, though they rebuilt and restored, would never forget the horror that had been unleashed upon them. They would never forget the twisted, eldritch creature that had brought about their downfall, and the unholy presence that had haunted their town. The memory of Wilbur Whateley and the abomination that had followed would be etched into their collective psyche, a constant reminder of the terrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality, waiting to pounce upon the unsuspecting and drag them down into the abyss of madness and despair. And yet, despite the passing of time, the horror that had been unleashed upon Dunwich would never truly be forgotten. It would linger, a dark and malevolent presence, waiting to strike, waiting to unleash its unholy terror upon the world once more. The old ones, those ancient, eldritch deities, would continue to lurk, waiting for the stars to align, waiting for the rituals to be performed, waiting for the sacrifices to be made. And when that day came, the world would tremble, the earth would shudder, and the skies would grow dark, as the unholy presence of the old ones would be unleashed upon the world, bringing about a reign of terror and madness that would never truly end. In the end, it was not the creature that had been the true horror, but the knowledge that had been gained, the knowledge that had been uncovered, and the implications that it had brought. The realization that the world was not as it seemed, that there were forces beyond the veil of reality, waiting to pounce, waiting to unleash their unholy terror upon the world. The realization that the human mind was not equipped to handle such knowledge, that it was too fragile, too weak, to comprehend the eldritch horrors that lurked beyond the stars. And it was this knowledge, this terrible, soul-shattering knowledge that would haunt the survivors of Dunwich and the world at large for eternity, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked in the darkness, waiting to consume us all. The darkness that had been unleashed upon Dunwich would never truly be vanquished, for it was a part of the very fabric of the universe, a reminder that the world was not always as it seemed, and that the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality were always waiting patiently for their chance to strike. And so, the people of Dunwich and the world at large would always live in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the darkness that lurked beyond the stars, and fear of the eldritch horrors that waited patiently for their chance to unleash their unholy terror upon the world. The horror of Dunwich would never truly be forgotten, for it was a part of the very fabric of the human psyche, a reminder of the terrors that lurked beyond the veil of sanity, and the unholy presence that waited patiently to consume us all.